There is something people misunderstand about Rafael and Nadal. They see the fist pumps, the intensity, the warrior who fought through pain and doubt and physical breakdown for over 2 decades without ever appearing to lose the fire. They see all of that and they assume they know what drove him. They assume it was love. Love for the game. Love for competition. Love for the feeling of winning. They are only half right. Because underneath the love, underneath the passion and the dedication and the extraordinary physical commitment that made Nadal one of the most compelling athletes any sport has ever produced, there was something else. Something harder. Something that doesn't fit the carefully constructed image of the humble champion from Mallorca who just wanted to compete and give everything he had every single time he walked on a court. Rafael Nadal could hate, quietly, deeply, with the intensity that matched everything else about him. And for one specific opponent, one man whose presence in his career created a tension that went beyond rivalry into something more complicated and more personal, that a feeling never fully disappeared. Not during the years they competed. Not after retirement came for both of them. Not ever. That man was Novak Djokovic. To understand the Nadal-Djokovic dynamic, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of their rivalry. That is well documented, endlessly analyzed, debated across thousands of hours of tennis commentary. The beginning of what the rivalry meant to Nadal specifically, what it cost him, what it took from him that he never got back. Nadal came on tour as something the sport had never quite seen. The physicality, the topspin that defied what anyone believed a tennis ball could do. The mental toughness that seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of human psychology. He was 17 years old and already playing like someone who had spent decades learning how to suffer productively. Clay was his surface, his kingdom. And on clay, he was something close to unbeatable. Then Djokovic arrived. Not immediately as a threat, not in the beginning when he was still developing, still finding the consistency that would eventually make him the most reliable performer in the history of the sport. But gradually, match by match, year by year, Djokovic built something specifically designed, whether consciously or not, to dismantle what Nadal had constructed. The flexibility that neutralized Nadal's heavy topspin. The return of serve that turned Nadal's biggest weapon into a neutral ball. The baseline game that could sustain rallies longer than Nadal wanted to sustain them and emerge from those rallies with the upper hand. Federer had been Nadal's great rival first. But Federer and Nadal had a relationship built on mutual reverence that softened the competition into something almost beautiful. The Djokovic rivalry had none of that softness. It was harder, more direct, more personal in ways that neither man always managed to conceal. 2012, Melbourne, the Australian Open final between Nadal and Djokovic. 5 hours and 53 minutes, the longest Grand Slam final in history. A match so physically brutal that both men could barely walk by the end of it. Djokovic won. 5-7, 6-4, 6-2, 6-7, 7-5. Nadal had been in finals before, had lost finals before. Losing was something he had learned to process, not easily, never easily, but with the discipline of someone who understood that defeat was part of the process. But this loss was different. Not because of the score, not even because of the length, because of what it represented. Nadal had given everything. Literally everything. His body was at its absolute limit by the fourth set. His movement was compromised. His shots were coming from a place that had nothing left to give. And it still wasn't enough. Djokovic had matched him physically, tactically, mentally, in every dimension that Nadal had always believed was his advantage, and come out the other side still standing. Nadal sat in his chair after the match, and the expression on his face was not the gracious defeat expression the cameras usually captured. It was something rawer than that. Something that took longer to process and compose into the appropriate public response. Because what Nadal felt in that moment went beyond disappointment. It was the specific feeling of having your greatest strengths rendered insufficient by someone who had studied you completely and built precise answers to every question you knew how to ask. That feeling doesn't leave easily. That feeling accumulates. Numbers tell stories that words sometimes can't. And the numbers in the Nadal-Djokovic head-to-head tell a story that Nadal carried like weight through the second half of his career. They played 60 times. Djokovic won 30. Nadal won 29. One match separated them across a rivalry that spanned nearly 2 decades. On the surface, that looks like balance, and like two equals trading victories across a lifetime of competition. But the distribution tells a different story. In their early years, Nadal held the advantage. On clay, his surface, his kingdom, he dominated Djokovic for years in ways that suggested the gap would never fully close. Then something shifted. Around 2011, 2012, the results started moving in Djokovic's direction. Not dramatically. Not in a way that announced itself as a permanent change, but consistently, persistently, in the matches that mattered most on the stages that carried the most weight. Australian Open Finals, Wimbledon Semifinals, US Open Finals. The moments when a career is defined, when the difference between greatness and the specific greatness Nadal was chasing came down to one match against one opponent, Djokovic was increasingly on the right side of the result. Nadal won 14 French Opens. 14. On clay against the greatest players of his generation across 2 decades. That number is almost incomprehensible. But on hard courts, in the moments when his body was at its most compromised and the opposition was at its most precise, Djokovic found the answers, again and again, with a reliability that Nadal could not dismiss and could not fully accept. The hatred, and it was hatred, even if Nadal would never use that word in public, even if the gracious champion image required more careful language, came from something specific, something beyond results and rankings and head-to-head records. It came from the feeling of being understood too completely. Djokovic had studied Nadal with a thoroughness that went beyond normal tactical preparation. He had analyzed every pattern, every tendency, every physical and mental response to pressure. He knew where Nadal's shots landed under stress. He knew which situations triggered which decisions. He knew the body, the famous left knee, the various injuries that accumulated over years of playing a physically punishing game. And he knew how to extend rallies in ways that made those injuries matter more. That knowledge felt like a violation to Nadal. Not literally, but there is something deeply uncomfortable about facing someone who knows you better than you want to be known, but who has turned the intimate details of how you compete, things you haven't even fully articulated to yourself, into a tactical system designed to defeat you. It removes the privacy from competition. It makes the court feel smaller and more exposed than it should. Federer never made Nadal feel that way. Their rivalry had a different quality, more instinctive, more about physical and stylistic contrast than about systematic deconstruction. Djokovic made Nadal feel like a problem being solved, and Nadal, proud, fiercely private about his internal world despite the external expressiveness, found that unbearable. 2022. Nadal's body is in serious conversation with him about how much longer this can continue. The foot injury that had plagued him for years. The abdominal tear that forced him to withdraw from Wimbledon. The accumulation of physical damage that 2 decades of playing the most physically demanding version of tennis anyone had ever attempted was producing in real time. And through all of it, through the injuries and the comebacks and the extraordinary French Open title that year that defied every medical prediction, the Djokovic question remained unresolved. Because Djokovic kept winning, kept finding ways to be there at the end of tournaments, kept accumulating Grand Slam titles that moved him past Federer, past Nadal, into a territory of statistical dominance that rewrote the conversation Nadal had spent his career having. Nadal had defined himself against that conversation, had built his legacy in direct relationship to Federer and Djokovic and the greatest of all time debate that consumed tennis for 2 decades. And now Djokovic was winning that debate in the most concrete way possible. Not through argument, but through trophies. 24 Grand Slams against Nadal's 22. A number that Nadal could not dismiss and could not chase anymore because his body had finally made the decision his competitive spirit never would have made voluntarily. He retired in November 2024. The announcement came with the grace and dignity that had always characterized his public presence. The words were right. The emotion was genuine. The gratitude was real. But somewhere underneath all of it, underneath the retirement speech and the farewell tour, and the carefully maintained composure of a champion ending things on his own terms, the Djokovic feeling remained unresolved, unchanged. The specific feeling that comes from spending 20 years competing at the absolute limit of human capability against someone who matched you completely and then exceeded you in the column that history remembers most. Rafael Nadal loved tennis more than almost anything. Loved competition. Loved his family and his team and the island of Mallorca that shaped everything about who he was. But Novak Djokovic, the man who studied him completely, who built precise answers to every question Nadal knew how to ask, who accumulated the titles that moved the greatest of all time conversation in a direction Nadal's body wouldn't let him follow. Djokovic was the one he could never fully make peace with, the one he truly hated more than anyone, and the one who, by existing and competing the way he did, made Rafael Nadal one of the greatest athletes the world has ever seen.